What's up, everyone? Thanks for tuning in this week. Clearly today, we're talking about something a little different. That is using effects pedals with our horn. Whether it was Miles Davis in the 70s, Roy Hargrove in the early 2000s, or any of the great players out there today who are using these pieces of equipment to enhance the musical experience for the listener, we're going to break this down a little bit today. Now, I did release a couple lessons on this about a year ago, but today we're going to break down that specific sound that we started with, the auto wah or envelope filter, however we want to think about it. This is one that I think sounds really great on brass instruments and was really like one of the first things that I tried to get a handle on when I started working in this world about 10 years ago. So we're not going to talk too much about gear today. There's a lot of variation here. And whether you're using a multi-effects pedal, individual stomp boxes, or even using your computer to create these sounds, the concepts that we talk about today are going to be universal across all these different things. But the individual pedals are going to vary. They're all going to have different characters of their sound. Some of them are going to have different settings that give you different options. But we're going to talk in a little more broad brushstrokes about this type of sound. So I will give you the short version of the gear that I'm using. To start out with, I'm using a Sennheiser 421 dynamic microphone. This is one of my go-to kind of like live choices of a microphone. I love a non-clip-on microphone because I really like to be in and out, lean in and lean back a little bit just to kind of control dynamics. And also with this effect stuff, it really does change the sound. That goes directly into my multi-effects board via an impedance changer. That is going to take the microphone signal and turn it into a signal that is more like a guitar. And I'm using this. This is a Line 6 Firehawk FX multi-effects pedal. You can see it's got like kind of all the buttons, knobs, all that kind of stuff that we'd imagine with this, but I can actually tell you a lot of the parameters are controlled via an app with this particular pedal, which I really like because then it allows you to control everything in real time. Sometimes these multi-effects pedals, you can kind of get stuck in sub-menus and stuff when you're trying to fiddle with them in real time. This kind of goes around that particular issue. Now, the reason I use this versus a bunch of stomp boxes, you can check out the other videos for that. Mostly it has to do with the cost. This is a much more affordable option, and this is not something I use on every single gig. And also I like the instant programmability of this, so I can quickly change between different sounds. Now, I mentioned an app. You will see me display that a couple of times here in this lesson, just to kind of talk about some of the settings and how the effects chain works for this sound. I should also add that today I'm going right into my recording software. Normally I would play this right into the soundboard, but when I'm practicing at home, I use it through a powered speaker rather than a guitar cabinet or amp. I've just found that to be a little more successful for me. All right, so let's get into how we build this sound. We're gonna break this down into two categories of things we need to worry about. We're gonna start with sort of the boring but necessary effects, and then we'll go to the fun effects that actually like make this sound happen. So for a long time when I was working with these sort of devices, I didn't really know about these like first couple of boring effects, and they are really the thing that is going to make this work, going sort of like from the practice room or working on it at home and then taking it to a gig and having it really function the way you want it to. I think most people who kind of deal with this stuff, especially when you're using a microphone as compared to a guitar, when you actually take it to a real world where there's drums and all this kind of stuff, you can struggle with feedback and other things that just make the sounds you think you had dialed in not really work so well in a real world setting. These first couple of things will really, really help with that a lot. The first thing you use, and I actually use this in almost every one of the sounds that is different from my sort of natural trombone sound, is a gate. A gate is an effects pedal or just a general effect that is not going to let any sound through until it reaches a certain level of loudness. It is a gate. When it is closed, nothing is going through, and as soon as it opens, everything is going through. So most gates are going to have a number of settings. The two that you really want to worry about are the threshold and the decay. Sometimes decay will be called release as well. The threshold is basically how loud does it need to be before the gate opens. You generally want this to be as subtle as possible while the gate's still doing its job. Now, on a sound like this where I'm playing relatively loud the entire time, or if I was using like an overdriven sound or something like that, the gate can be relatively aggressive because I'm not really going to be leaning into it quite a bit when I'm actually playing. However, on some sounds, you might want it to be a little more subtle. So you want that dB to not be too aggressive. So once you have your threshold set and you kind of have found that sweet spot where it does its job, but it's not too aggressive, where it's sort of like keeping your more quiet dynamics out of the signal, you've got to figure out what to do with that decay/release knob. You can think of the release knob as how quickly that gate closes after the sound gets below that threshold level. Again, finding that sweet spot is key. If you have too fast of a decay, the notes are all going to sound clipped. So I'm going to set mine to 0. So there is like 0 milliseconds of decay, and I'm just going to do it on a clean sound. You will hear how each note sounds like it's chopped off just a little bit. Now I'll set that decay to a more reasonable place where I'm going to get just a little bit of the note ringing. Again, it would still close, so any like extra noise from the drums or any of the rest of the band would not make it through as long as it was not above that threshold, but it's going to give my playing a much more natural sound at the end of the notes. Okay, so that is super important for controlling feedback and just controlling any extra noise that's going to get in your microphone. If you were playing guitar, this would not necessarily be an issue because those other instruments are not going to affect that signal coming through your guitar. But with a microphone, super, super important. Now, I mentioned the effects chain. This is something that's really important. As you work in this area, you realize that the way you set these up and the order that they go in that kind of chain of signal flow is really, really important to how they work. Our gate is always going to go at the very beginning. Okay, on to our next effect that is super important, but not very flashy. That is compression. Now, if you've done any kind of work with recording or kind of working in audio, you probably know what compression is. Basically what this does is it's going to automatically decrease our volume once that volume reaches a certain level. We might think that this is not so good because it's going to limit our dynamic spectrum. However, for certain effects and just in certain settings, this can be very useful, not only for controlling volume, but also making our sound sit at the right place in the mix. This effect in particular has a very wide dynamic range. So I'm going to play you a very short example without compression, and then I'll play it for you again with compression. I think you're going to hear the difference. We will also look at the waveform where you will absolutely see the difference and see what the compression is doing. So hopefully you could hear the difference, but let's look at these waveforms so you can really see what's going on here. To start with, we've got our uncompressed signal. You'll see a big spike at the beginning of each one of these attacks. This particular effect, due to the sweeping nature of this envelope filter, which we'll get into in a moment, it creates these big spikes at the beginning of the note as it quickly sweeps across the frequency spectrum. So that makes these giant transients at the beginning of the attacks of the notes. This can be really problematic for feedback and just in general problematic for your sound person to make this like sit at the right place in the mix so that like you can be heard in context with the rest of the band. Now, if we put just a little bit of compression on this, I don't have my settings particularly aggressive here. You can see it just kind of contains everything in a smaller dynamic spectrum. And again, we can think that that's going to limit our expression, but here we really want that so that we're not sort of like battling feedback or the sudden spikes in our dynamic, and then the sort of quiet parts of our playing really get lost. So to achieve this, there are two main settings that we need to worry about. Compressors have lots of different settings, and this is a big area, especially if you're into recording. But for this, we want to think about simple settings. We want to control the threshold and then the makeup gain. Just like our gate, our compressor also has a threshold, but it works in a slightly different way. Here, the threshold is going to be the level where the compressor kicks on and starts to automatically bring our dynamic down. You can think that as our dynamic gets louder, it's just going to keep going up naturally. Then when it reaches that threshold, the compressor is going to start to decrease it by a certain ratio. You can kind of think it like it's almost like somebody has their finger on a fader that entire time. So as soon as your signal gets a little too loud, they're going to break it down by just a little bit to help it, again, stay at the right level for the entire performance. So here I will show this app interface that I mentioned, and you can see on the top it has all these different little pedals. My gate is all the way over at the one end, and my compressor is highlighted right now. It's somewhere in the middle. Where you put this could make a difference, not necessarily a huge deal for our discussion today. You can see I have my threshold set quite high here. I only want it to affect those immediate transients or the beginnings of the notes where it's super loud. I don't want it to affect my kind of general playing. So it's really mostly working on those transients here. Now, below that, you can see there is a slider that says gain. This particular app has these all as sliders versus knobs, but you can equate these to sort of where they would be on a knob. I have this set to 2 dB. So what that's doing is the compressor, as it's kind of bringing some of my signal down, that 2 dB of gain, that's pushing the entire signal then back up a little bit. We might call that makeup gain. This has the effect of taking this entire broad spectrum of dynamics I'm playing and squishing it down just a little bit so it fits in kind of that same dynamic range, so that way when it's being mixed, it kind of sits in the right place in the mix with all of the other instruments. That makeup gain is important. It's going to help our quiet things not get lost, while that threshold, it's going to bring some of those super loud things down just a little bit so they're not feeding back or peaking the system. Now, our final boring but very helpful set of effects are EQ and reverb. Today, I actually have both of these turned off on my pedal board. However, in a live setting, I do use both of them. For this recording, I'm going to do this all in my DAW after I record, just because the EQ and the reverb needs might be a little bit different for recording than when I play live. However, I do like to bake a little bit of reverb into my sounds because I'm trying to think like a guitar player here, and most guitar players are going to have a little bit of reverb maybe coming from their amp or from something on a pedal board. And then the EQing, I like to have control over that because these sounds are all very, very different. My natural sound versus this sound versus some of the other sounds I use need different EQ things. And so rather than relying on the sound person to have to like switch between these things, that's not really very helpful for them doing their job. They're not necessarily going to know where I'm changing these different sounds in the show. So I like to have some of that in my pedal board. That's going to give a better result live. All right, that's the boring stuff. If you feel like you've tried to use some of these pieces of equipment live and just never gotten the results you wanted, it's very likely that you need to spend a little bit of time, particularly with gate and compression, to make them work the way you want to. Let's get to the interesting stuff. So the thing that really makes this sound is a pedal that we call an envelope filter, or sometimes referred to as an auto wah filter. You could certainly do this with an actual wah pedal, and I think that's actually how Miles was doing it in the 70s. But I think most modern horn players use one of these envelope filters. There are many of them on the market. Some of the ones that come to mind that a lot of people like to use are the MXR bass envelope filter and the Qtron. I know those are some that I see people use that are individual stomp boxes. Again, I'm doing this on a multi-effects pedal. Most multi-effects pedals are going to have some sort of thing that emulates these individual stomp boxes. So to start with, let's just hear a little bit of what that sounds like just with the envelope filter on and these other sort of quote unquote boring effects to kind of make it all work. So we get that sort of classic quacky sound that we associate with this auto wah sound. This works really great on brass instrument. It's actually a really fun pedal to play with because it sort of reacts to you. It's kind of a dance between you and the pedal. The harder you push on it, the more it does the effect. The less you do, the more subtle effects you can get. It's a really fun thing to work with as a wind player. Now, some of the parameters you're going to want to think about dealing with whichever pedal you have. They all have slightly different settings, but there's two main things you're going to kind of want to fiddle with to find the sweet spot that works for you for the sound that you're looking for. Most pedals in this category are going to have something called the Q value. And you can kind of think this as how intense this effect is going to be. We're going to get too much into sort of like the science of how these work and kind of like the frequency sweeping and that type of stuff. But the lower the Q value we have, the less of this we're going to hear. So if we put this with a relatively low Q value, you're just not going to hear as much of the effect. Now, conversely, if we put the Q value quite high, which is actually where I like it, you're going to just get a lot more of the like quacky sound. That's because the sort of signal sweep is more dramatic. Experimenting with this is going to be one of the big things you've got to dial in with this particular sound. Different pedals are going to respond differently. And so you've got to kind of figure it out about where works best for the sound that you're going. A higher Q value is not always better. It really depends on what you're looking for in this sound. The other important parameter with this type of effect, and you could see that when I displayed that app interface, is the sensitivity. Now, unlike the Q value, I like my sensitivity to be relatively low. You can think of this as like how sensitive the pedal is. The lower you set it, the harder you're going to have to play, or the louder you're going to have to play, I should say, to make it have the effect that you're looking for. If you have it set very high, the envelope filter is sort of like always going to be engaged at the maximum level because it is being very sensitive. So you're not going to get the response that you want. Now, conversely, if I set that down a little bit lower where I started, I like mine around like 20 to 30% on this particular pedal. So on like a knob-based pedal, that's probably going to be somewhere between like, maybe 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock in that region of a knob. It's going to sound a little bit more like this. This is one that I often am changing while I'm soloing. At the beginning of the solo where I maybe want to be a little more subtle, playing a little quieter, I might turn the sensitivity up so it's still sort of catching that quieter sound. As I go through my solo and I start to play more loud, more intense, I might turn that sensitivity down so I'm not forcing the pedal to engage so much and I can still play with that auto wah sound. If I just left the sensitivity the same the entire time, but didn't tweak it slightly, and I'm not going that much on this particular interface, I'm only moving it by about 5 to 10%, so that's not going to be very much on a knob, but that's going to allow you to get like good response to the entirety of your solo. This particular effect usually goes near the front of the effects chain, whether it's for us as horn players or guitar players. So I can move this wherever I want in that effects chain on this app, which is really great. For you, if you're doing a pedal board, you're going to want to be more thoughtful about where you put that just to make sure it makes sense with all the different sounds that you are looking for. Now, this sound I've been using so far is actually different than the sound I was using up top of this video today. And that's because I was using a couple of other things in there that I think are just nice additions that add some extra character to this sound. The first thing that I really like to employ is a harmonizer. Harmonizers sound great on all wind instruments in this kind of area of music making. The one that I'm using here is modeled off of the Digitech Whammy pedal. That's a great one if you want to like get an actual stomp box. Lots of these on the market. You can check out some information on those on your own. Even though we might think harmonizer, great, I can finally play high as a trombone player, I actually think the octave down is where it's at and really is the sound that sounds nice with this sort of stuff. It adds a great thickness, body, and like funkiness to this sound. Some of these particular category pedals have more settings than other ones. The one that I have is relatively simplistic. It just has what harmony you're trying to add, octave up, octave down, all that kind of good stuff, or whatever interval you want to add. But then it also has a mix knob. Here I have my mix set at about 40%, so just a little bit less than 50-50. I tend to find that's where I like it. Sometimes a little less than 50, a little more than 50. You want to have a little bit of that original sound in there oftentimes, just so you still get some attack and kind of precision of articulation. When I also employ the harmonizer, I sometimes find that I need to, again, fiddle with that sensitivity knob on the envelope filter. The way these interact really like changes that component of the effect. So you might need to mess around with that a little bit depending on where you put it in your effect chain. I have my harmonizer set as the second thing in my chain, actually even before my envelope filter. I found that I like it there a little bit more. That sort of like decreases the amount that I need to mess with that sensitivity knob. However, I still do sometimes. When I put it after the envelope filter, I just have to mess with that sensitivity knob a little bit more. I think the harmonizer sort of like evens out the signal and almost like compresses it a little bit. So that way I don't have as big of changes in my dynamic, even when I'm playing dynamically on my horn. So you just kind of decide where it works best for you, experiment a little with it, and you will figure out where it sounds best. Now, the final element that I like to add into this sound is a little bit of delay. Delay and reverb are very, very similar in some ways. They both are time-based effects. Reverb is going to sort of emulate how your sound bounces around in a space, whereas delay is really just repeating your sound at a later time, and that is what we want for this particular sound. There are a lot of different delay pedals that you could purchase with different settings, different sound characters. We're really just going to talk about a couple of the basic settings to kind of get you going on this. The first thing we want to think about is the time of delay, and whether we're going to do that in milliseconds or whether we're going to use a tap tempo and connect it to rhythm. Both are potentially helpful in different situations. Today, I'm actually going to use my tap tempo. So on many delay pedals, there's going to be a button that says tap, and just like on your metronome, you're going to tap that at the tempo you're going, and that is going to set the parameters of the delay based on what you've told it to, whether that is you want quarter note delay, eighth note delay, dotted eighth note delay, whatever. There's a lot of different options. Now, the other two important settings are the mix knob and the number of repeats. On my particular pedal, it's called the feedback knob. The mix is just going to determine how much of the delayed signal versus how much of your clean signal you want. And that number of repeats is sort of like how many repeats it happens before it fades away. So if you have a very short number, it's going to be very subtle. A huge number, and it's really going to like build up over time, which you might want depending on what you're going for. If you want something really sort of like washy and really creating a soundscape, you might want a lot of delays. But if you want something that's very clean, just adding a little body and dimension to the sound, you might want a lot fewer delays. I have mine set at kind of like a medium to a low medium on both of these. I want to hear it for this particular sound, but I don't want it to become overwhelming. Okay, that is how I build this sound. So let's hear all of this in action. I'm going to play just a little short solo where I start with just my auto wah sound with no other effects, add a little bit of harmonizer, add a little bit of delay to see how this all sort of interacts with each other. All right, there's just a little bit of a taste of what you can do with this particular sound. I really think it's one that is particularly useful as a wind player. It really works with you as you're playing and kind of reacts to your playing in a really musical and I think natural way once you've practiced with these pieces of equipment a little bit. As always, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the woodshed.